Okay, so in our final section of our first lecture series, we're going to start to get into sentence diagramming. Now, as I said before, sentence diagramming is a great way to make underlying linguistic structures visible. Now, a lot of the Virginia SOLs for varying grades incorporate some aspect of sentence diagramming, so it's going to be good for you to understand, have a good understanding of how to do this as a teacher, and this is also really helpful for visual learners, for people who aren't necessarily good with words and can't just understand grammatical concepts by looking at a sentence or looking at a couple of different sentence examples. Sentence diagramming is a great way to actually show them what you mean when you talk about a hanging preposition, or how an adjective modifies a noun versus an adverb modifying a noun, because we can look at those things and see that, hey, this adverb is hanging from the verb, or this adjective is hanging from the noun. So we'll talk about some of those things, and we're going to get kind of a little bit more complex in our second lecture series. But here, if we look at this example, we can see a really complex sentence, and before you freak out, know that I'm not going to ask you to do anything this complex. This is a pretty complex sentence. We can see a lot of different things going on here. We've got this and conjunction. Down here, a lot of different adjectival information going on. So a lot of different things happening here that we're not going to get into all of them in the scope of this course. But let's go ahead and get started and start looking at some simple sentences. So before we start diagramming sentences, there's two things that we're going to need to know. We're going to need to know about noun phrases and verb phrases, since those are the two main constituents that we need to create a full sentence. So a noun phrase is something that has to contain a noun and will sometimes contain additional information or modifiers, such as adjectives, articles, or determiners like the or a, and prepositional phrases that can provide adjectival information. So here we can see a pretty large noun phrase that in whole is the box in the corner. So here we have the box, which is our main noun or the head word of our sentence. We've got this determiner here saying, okay, well, it is the only box as opposed to a box, meaning one of many boxes in the room. And then we have in the corner a prepositional phrase that comes off of box that describes which box. Saying the box, well, if I needed some clarification, which box do you want me to move? Oh, I want you to move the box in the corner. So it's important to know that all of that information is considered part of the noun phrase. So a noun phrase, again, has to contain a noun, but can also contain articles, determiners, and extra prepositional phrases. Now let's compare that to a verb phrase. Now a verb phrase in a lot of ways is similar. It must contain a verb. So here if we look at this larger sentence, we have this noun phrase over here, which is just one noun, which is Claudia. So we've got Claudia over here by herself, and then all of this other information is a verb phrase. So like I said, it must contain a verb, but it could also contain multiple verbs if we have any sort of helping verbs in there. Has been, will be, modals, things like that. Sometimes it will contain more than one verb and be a phrasal verb. So here we have our verb, sat, and then over here we have another example of a prepositional phrase embedded in this verb phrase, on a stool. So that's our prepositional phrase, and then also we can see that within that prepositional phrase we have another noun phrase right here. So this prepositional phrase right here is providing adverbial information. It is saying where. Claudia sat. Well, where did she sit? She sat on a stool. And we'll get into some of the difference between adjectival and adverbial functions in lecture 2. So just, if this is kind of confusing, just let it go in one ear and out the other, and just know that we'll come back and we'll address this in more detail. But what you do need to know for right now is that a verb phrase is going to consist of at least a verb and then sometimes this extra information. So now let's go and let's look at some simple sentences. So this is how we would begin to construct a sentence diagram. And for all of these, there are much more detailed explanations, written explanations in the lecture notes. So go ahead and check those out if you haven't already. That's a lot of helpful information, a lot of things that will be reiterated in there that we've talked about in the lectures. So to begin diagramming a simple sentence, we're going to need to create a structure like this. We can do that by creating one horizontal line and then one vertical line. And this is going to separate our noun phrase. Sorry about that. Noun phrase from our verb phrase. So for example, if I were to start writing some example sentences, I'll start with the simplest thing being I am. So here we have a noun, or a pronoun in this case, being I, a verb being am. We could also do some other really simple things like we swam, or he went. And then we could also use other nouns. So these are a lot of examples of pronouns standing in for nouns. But we could also use nouns, full nouns. So we could say ball. Ball could be our main noun. But when we use ball, we don't want to just say ball. We're going to want to specify, we're going to want to use a determiner or an article to say whether it's the ball or a ball. So in a case, we'll say a ball bounced. So that's our the most simple sentence we can diagram right here. And again, we're going to create that by horizontal line, vertical line, extending all the way through the horizontal line. So creating kind of a crosshair right there. Then on the left side, we're going to have our noun phrase. Right side, we're going to have our verb phrase. So the next type of sentence that we're going to look at is something called a subject complement slot. So in the examples that we just gave, those sentences were pretty boring, weren't they? There wasn't a whole lot of information being given. So what would we do if we wanted to give a little bit more information? So say, for example, we're trying to describe a person or a thing. Sometimes we might want to use this subject complement slot. So we'll go ahead and we'll make our regular sentence diagram. So we have over here our noun phrase. We have over here verb phrase. And then what we're going to do to create a subject complement slot is we're going to draw a diagonal line that is pointing back towards the noun phrase, because ultimately it's going to modify this noun phrase. And then in this slot, we can either put a noun, another noun, or an adjective to describe this first noun phrase. So to give you an example, we'll start over here with our phrase Mike. And then usually when you're using subject complement slots, you're always going to use a version of a be verb. So we'll say Mike is. And then over here we'll have a subject complement of a chef. So we'll substitute in a noun for this. We'll say Mike is a chef. So we're telling you who or what Mike is using a noun. Now we could also do this with an adjective in the same way. We'll go ahead and draw our sentence diagram. We'll say, the dog. We'll draw this down here. The dog is, we'll say loud. Use an adjective to describe the dog. So the dog is loud. Again, that's kicking back here and describing that noun phrase. And that's why this subject complement line needs to tilt back towards the noun. So that's an example of how to use a subject complement slot. Again, we're going to have our noun phrase, verb phrase, the same requirements we had for our simple sentence. But then we're going to add in this subject complement slot and fill it with either a noun or an adjective. And the last type of sentence we're going to look at for this Lecture 1 series is a sentence with a direct object. So we can see that this is kind of similar to the subject complement slot, although there are some very important differences that we need to recognize. So again, we'll start off with our simple sentence. We've got our noun phrase, verb phrase, and then to add a direct object, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a vertical line extending from this original horizontal line. But the important thing to note here is it does not intersect. So you can see down here, it extends from this horizontal line upwards, but does not intersect or transverse this horizontal line. And this is where we'll put our direct object, which in most cases is going to be another noun. So let's go ahead and give some examples. So we'll stick with Mike as our subject. So Mike did what? We'll say he threw. So what did he throw? I mean, he could throw a multitude of things, you know. So we could in here have the ball. Mike could also throw a tantrum. And both of those things are direct objects. Now, the other important thing to note, and this is not something that you'll be quizzed on, but also might be some helpful information, is you might be asking now, so what about a sentence with an indirect object? Sentence with an indirect object is actually going to be diagrammed below the verb. So we could say, if Mike threw Jim the ball, that's how we would diagram that. Mike threw Jim the ball. The ball is still the direct object since it is receiving the action, the main recipient of that action, of the throwing, and then Jim only indirectly is receiving that ball. So we would diagram that on the line below the verb. Although, again, the only thing that I'm going to be concerned with you knowing for your Grammar 1 quiz is this noun phrase, verb phrase, direct object sentence diagram. So now that you've had a good overview of grammar, it might be helpful to go ahead and review the lecture notes. Make sure you take the grammar self-check before you take the quiz. That's going to give you a helpful review, give you some feedback on what you might need to go back and review in some of these lectures.